Alright, so some of you might have no idea what this is right here, but it's actually a PC case that I've been looking forward to for over 2 years now. It's called the Dan C4-SFX. Some of you might be familiar with the much smaller version, the A4-SFX. This is a fair bit bigger, but it can fit so much more hardware. Believe it or not, it's slightly smaller than the Ncase M1, but somehow more flexible, more build opportunities with larger radiator and fan support as well. So today we'll take a look at those different layouts, which ones are good, which ones should be avoided, and what kind of thermal performance you can expect, and ultimately just how this does compare to something like an Ncase M1, which is a very similar size. So on the outside, the Dan C4-SFX looks like a pretty typical small form factor case manufactured by Lee & Lee, and the result is a 12-litre shell that looks like a hybrid between the Ncase M1 and the Ghost S1. This size is pretty much perfect for a minimal desktop ITX system in my opinion. Any smaller than this and you start compromising on thermal performance for high-end systems, and any larger really isn't necessary for most builds. Since it shares the same bloodline as the M1, everything from build quality and the look and finish of the side panels are pretty much identical. It's a very premium aluminium case that will last multiple years and many rebuilds. Just like the M1, this could very well be the last PC case that you ever buy, and another reason for that is just how much hardware you can fit inside it. The first layout here that we'll take a look at is the classic layout. It's a very intuitive, very M1-like layout that's proven to be pretty much as space optimized as a 12-litre PC case can get. In this layout, you can do either air cooling or liquid cooling for the CPU. Up to a 240 or 280 mm radiator can be mounted on the side bracket, and then for air cooling you've got up to 130 mm of clearance to play with. So your best option here for air cooling would be the Noctua U9S with a dual fan setup, but just like the M1 you can also fit the slightly better C14S by relocating the power supply to the front of the case. This brings me to another really cool feature about this case, and that's that it can be completely flipped and used upside down, and this is probably the best feature of the Dan C4-SFX and the main advantage over the Ncase M1. Flipping the classic layout, for example, now means that the graphics card doesn't need to fight to pull fresh air from underneath the case, and instead now there is a ton of air up above to take advantage of. This does raise a concern though, and that's that you now need to consider more carefully where that hot air from the GPU ends up. For example, if you're running an AIO with fans as exhaust, a lot of that heat is just going to get sucked into the radiator and lead to much warmer CPU temps. Now the other layout of this case is the sandwich layout, allowing you to vertically mount your graphics card in front of the motherboard and then liquid cool the CPU with a 240mm AIO, but we'll come back to this one in just a minute because, long story short, it needs a lot of work. Now strangely, despite this having a slightly smaller frame than the Ncase M1, it actually supports bigger radiators and fans. You can install two 140mm fans at the bottom directly underneath a 2-slot graphics card, and then on the side bracket you can install up to a 280mm radiator or two 140mm fans for air cooling. This also means potentially you could do a dual 280mm custom loop inside the C4-SFX, which is absolutely insane for a 12-litre case. Very important note though, if you are flipping the case, which actually ends up being the recommended way to go here, 140mm fans will no longer fit at the bottom, since you now need to make room for the top panel mounting clips. You can still mount a pair of 120mm fans here though, which will be powerful enough to feed air to your graphics card. And another really important note, one which I hopefully gets fixed, flipping the case means that there will be no panel at all on the bottom, so hopefully that gets sorted before launch because the cables kind of just end up hanging out. Now as for building in the C4-SFX, it was super easy and almost identical to the Ncase M1. Graphics card installation actually was a bit easier in fact, since the locking bracket can be completely removed and the GPU can just be dropped straight in. 3-slot graphics cards up to 315mm in length and 130mm in height can be installed here, leaving you with plenty of options. So in the end, the C4-SFX in classic mode looks just like a slightly smaller, slightly smoother edged Ncase M1. This test build uses an overclocked 10900K, a 280mm liquid cooler, and two 140mm fans at the bottom. All fans are positioned as intake, and the case is passively exhausting all of that hot air out the top. So how is the performance? Well, in terms of CPU thermals, our overclocked i9 10900K runs about 1 degree cooler than the Ncase M1 at an almost identical noise level, seeing as we're able to accommodate accommodate a 280ml liquid cooler versus the 240 in the Ncase. When we flip the case though, CPU thermals increase by about 3 degrees, seeing as we now have less room to exhaust all of that hot air. Keep this in mind because it's a really important note. When we take a look at GPU thermals though, surprisingly they are measurably worse than the Ncase M1 at 76 degrees C for our 2070 Super, until we flip the case, positioning the GPU now as top intake. GPU temps now improve by 4 degrees, giving us one of the best results in the stack, which is not bad at all. Now what happens when we throw in an RTX 3080 Founders Edition? This card runs at 320 watts and has a much more unique way of getting rid of all of that heat. As we've seen previously, this design works incredibly well in the Ncase M1, but it's a bit more challenged here in the C4-SFX. Here we actually have less of an air gap in the middle of the case, part of which is blocked by the tubing of the AIO, and this is really the only path for that second GPU fan to exhaust all of its heat. In the end, we run about 4 degrees warmer here than the Ncase M1, since we're working with a tighter space. That does improve a little when we flip the case, but now we run into another problem. Some of that hot air from the GPU is being passed straight into the radiator. Although this is ideal for the GPU, that's a great way to run into CPU thermal problems, especially in combined CPU and GPU usage scenarios like a very CPU intensive game, for example. Now I'm actually not going to spend too long talking about the sandwich layout of this case because, to be completely honest, it has one major downfall that needs a lot of work, and that's CPU cooling. Despite being able to accommodate up to a 240ml AIO here, it basically gets no airflow at all. In fact, under the same test conditions as other cases, even those with smaller coolers, the Dan C4-SFX runs significantly hotter when used in this layout. So there are 3 main reasons why the cooling is so bad here. Firstly, when the case is flipped, air has to pass through 2 layers of ventilation, one for the top panel and then one for the frame. This means that the effective ventilation for those top fans isn't actually as much as you'd think. In fact, just by removing the top panel, I was able to drop CPU temps by over 5 degrees. Secondly, about half of the radiator is blocked by the riser cable, making it very difficult for air to pass through. And lastly, probably most importantly, the 240ml AIO can only pull fresh air from one side of the case. So it's not like the Form T1 or Ghost S1 where a top-mounted radiator can pull air from both the GPU side and motherboard side. Here only one side gives access to airflow. So the sandwich layout in the Dan C4-SFX needs to be reworked heavily in my opinion, because CPU cooling is just not viable with this setup. GPU cooling with this setup on the other hand is rock solid though, about 1 degree better than using the classic flipped layout with an AIO, so maybe there is something promising here. So at this point there was one more build / configuration in the Dan C4-SFX which I think would be ideal for extracting the most GPU performance that you could out of this case, and one which could actually beat the Ncase M1, and that's this build here. So we've got air cooling the CPU with the Noctua U9S, we've got a 140ml fan, and then a 2-slot GPU at the top assisted by some fans pulling air through. So we've got intake here, intake for the CPU, and then all of that hot air that's building up inside the case is being exhausted by the 140mm fan. So with this setup, we get our lowest GPU thermals yet, especially when using the 3080 Founders Edition. Now we're actually able to properly exhaust all of that hot air building up inside the C4-SFX, and I'd happily conclude that this is the optimal way to run this case for a gaming focused build. Most notably, you can achieve GPU thermals here that are slightly better than the Ncase M1, and I think the difference here would be even greater if you were using a larger 2.5 slot or 3 slot graphics card without the additional fans helping it underneath. Flipping the C4-SFX is so vital because then graphics cards don't need to fight to pull air from underneath the case, and that is more challenging for the stock slim fans that you'll find on those bigger graphics cards. The only downside of this layout is that CPU cooling will take a bit of a hit. Your best option here would be the Noctua U9S with 2 fans, and I'd say you're good for about 150 watts of CPU power there, being conservative. I'm actually running it with a single fan in this build, and that's almost enough to handle the overclocked 10900K that I've got in there, running at about 210 watts. So I guess the best way to sum up this case is that if you're not going to do this layout here, which is kind of the ideal layout for a gaming focused build since it runs the GPU the coolest and the quietest and has the most performance in that regard, then probably don't bother, because the sandwich layout just absolutely sucks when it comes to CPU cooling. And then if you're going to do this layout but then flipped, so kind of like an Ncase M1, you should probably just build in an Ncase M1. That case does that layout a little bit better because it has a little bit more of an air gap in the middle of the case, and that does seem to benefit thermals and airflow. Then as for custom loops in the C4-SFX, which is something that I'm really interested in trying because I think you might be able to even outperform the Ncase M1, you can do a 240mm at the top in this flipped layout, and then either a 240 or 280mm at the side, and there you can pretty much run absolutely anything. Then as for pricing and availability, this case is set to launch towards the end of this year at 230 euros, which is definitely pricey, but nothing out of the ordinary for these premium small batch cases. But in closing, overall, for a gaming focused build in this layout here, the C4-SFX is definitely up there as one of the best ITX cases. GPU thermals here are better than the Form T1, the Ncase M1, and the SSUPD Meshlicious, only to be beaten out by larger cases like the NR200. And I think just in general, with GPUs getting so much more power hungry and hotter and just demanding a lot more cooling, that makes a really strong case for the Dan C4-SFX as your next ITX case. Really interested to hear what you guys have to say about this one. As always, a huge thanks for watching, and I will see you all in the next one.